I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Julie Menin, the new Census czar of New York, and later we'll talk about changes to the questionnaire that could threaten the accuracy of the count. We'll also talk with Malachy Browne of the New York Times about a piece of forensic video journalism relating to the killing of a volunteer medic in the Middle East. But first, President Donald Trump appears to have narrowly averted a second shutdown. I'm here with Times contributing writer Clyde Haberman. The president didn't get the wall he wanted, so that looks like a big loss for the president politically, maybe not. Let's take a look at what the president said this week.
We have a lot of things happening right now. We're building a lot of wall right now with money that we already have.
So is that a loss or not? Or every time an immigrant commits a crime, is he going to blame it on the Democrats?
Well, of course. First of all, that's a lie. They're not building a lot of walls. So that's just nonsense right away. Yet another of Trump lie. Look, we're taping on Thursday afternoon, so a lot could happen in the next 24 hours. But it looks like McConnell says that Trump is going to use a national emergency declaration to get whatever he wants, which would mean shifting funds around. If this is what happens, it's a terribly dangerous precedent because there is no national emergency.
A dangerous precedent, not president.
Well, both, in fact, but precedent in this case, because there is, as I said, there's no national emergency, and B. So the next president could declare, excuse me, I'd be happy if the president declared a gun emergency and started confiscating guns. You want to go that route? Now, clearly that would be challenged very heavily and is probably unconstitutional. But this is an outrageous behavior on his part. But in theory, you're right. He did lose, but I think he's going to then simply take money from different pockets of the federal government and use it for this wall. But this nonsense of his about their pouring over the border is just simply not true. That they're all criminals, as he seems to imply, is not true. And the fact that they're building the wall left and right is absolutely untrue.
And the statistics don't seem to matter to his constituents.
Or to him. These people are truth challenged. They just simply live in another world from reality. Lord knows I have my problems with those on the far left too. But these folks who go to these Nuremberg rallies of his, like the one in El Paso the other day, are just not dealing with the world as it exists.
And is there any way to persuade people like that or get to them or get them to think?
I don't think so.
Any more than, I guess, people on the far left.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think they're unpersuadable. It's been, frankly, for me, and I know a lot of other people, a very depressing reality over the last 2 years plus. I am now convinced that despite all our constitutional institutions and democratic traditions, that perhaps a third of our country would vote for a out-and-out fascist. I'm not calling Trump an out-and-out fascist, but there's no question in my mind now that a third of Americans would support a Hitler, would support a Stalin, if he hit the buttons that gets them rolling. I mean, these people are like trained SEALs. He says something and they start chanting "lock her up." Guys, grow up.
Speaking of the radical left, President Trump said something about that group too.
I appreciate all the work the Republicans have done because they're really going against a radical left. It's a radical left.
Yeah, everything to him is social. That's going to be their new mantra, is against the Democrats, because they're going to use Ocasio-Cortez or Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and talk about they're all socialists. They're bringing up words that I thought we got rid of in the 60s.
Interesting, though, the radical left, if you want to call it that, or the left, or whatever it is, seemed to exert itself in New York this week in terms of the Amazon deal, a big blow to the governor and to the mayor. The mayor, interestingly enough, shot back and said, well, you know, Amazon refused to negotiate.
Right.
They didn't play fair. But wasn't it the mayor who was involved in the original deal? Wasn't he negotiating with them? Didn't he make the deal?
Yeah, well, the governor took a tougher line against the opponents in a statement that he issued on Thursday afternoon. I think their mistake was they didn't involve anybody. They didn't involve local people. I mean, I don't know any New Yorker who's got any sensibleness about him or her will want to throw away 25,000 to 40,000 jobs being talked about. But the community was not involved in any way. It was a take it or leave it deal presented, and a lot of people said, well, maybe we'll leave it. Look, you and I are clearly old enough. We covered the great fiscal crisis that had the city on its rear end in the mid-'70s, that it had to climb out of from this incredible hole. And we saw all sorts of corporate giveaways, all sorts of tax abatements and subsidies and whatever to keep people from fleeing the city. Well, that was then. This is the notion of $3 billion to the richest man on the planet rubbed a lot of people, understandably, a wrong way. Now,
And he called their bluff.
And he called their bluff.
Which he could afford to do.
Right, absolutely. But I don't understand why this had to be done in secret. There's no question that there are difficult procedural issues in New York. There's this horrible acronym, ULURP, Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, that could slow things down terribly, and they wanted to fast track it. Perfectly understandable. But if you're going to shut people out in their own neighborhoods, don't be surprised if it comes back to bite you on the you-know-what.
So if the governor and the mayor lost, did the opponents win?
I'm not so sure they did, because I think they're going to get blamed for losing all these jobs. So they're going to have to explain themselves. That includes Michael Gianaris in Queens, Jimmy Van Bramer there too, and probably Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. I'm guessing. I don't like predicting the future, but it seems to me there's a lot of blame to go around for how this was handled. Not that positions were necessarily wrong, but it was just handled rather badly.
It reminds me so much of the Westway situation, where Westway began as something that could have been sold as a great 100-acre park in the Hudson River, and unfortunately got killed as a highway.
Right.
Thanks to Clyde Haberman for joining us. And coming up next, the new director of the Census for New York City, Julie Menin. She'll talk about some vulnerability for the city on the new census form that you're going to get April 1st, 2020. The federal government is proposing a change in the 2020 census, adding a question about a person's citizenship. It's got many people, particularly in New York City, up in arms. Julie Menin is the city's new director of the Census for New York City. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Is the census, which starts about 11 months from now, in April of 2020, we know New York City is the biggest city in the country, so this is more than about bragging rights. Why is the census so important to New York?
Well, it's incredibly important, Sam, because there's $700 billion nationwide of federal funds that are allocated to over 300 different social service programs. So everything from public schools, public housing, Medicaid, SNAP, senior centers, all depend on getting a right count in New York City. And New York City deserves its fair share. In the past, in 2010, the response rate in New York City to the census was 61.9% of self-response. So we had so many New Yorkers that were not responding. We're going to really change that equation this time and work very hard on really the largest community outreach that the city's ever done on the census. And that's really why it's important.
Does that mean 39% weren't counted, or
No,
we just estimated the rest of them?
We estimated the rest of them, and that's really where the problem comes in, because if you don't respond, then an enumerator, which is just a fancy word for door knocker, comes to your door and knocks on the door and then works with you to fill the information out. And if you don't fill it out at all, there's imputation, which you and I were talking about in the break. But imputation is the most unreliable data. So what we're really saying to New Yorkers is that if you care about the funding for your senior center, if you care about the funding for your local public school or public housing or free lunch programs, take the 10 minutes to fill out the census census, because literally we're leaving money on the table. And who gets that money? It's other cities and other states. And you mentioned in the intro the citizenship question. So for the first time in 70 years, the Trump administration is asking a question: are you a U.S. citizen? And honestly, what this is a veiled attempt to intimidate immigrant communities across the city to not answer the census. And we're a city of 38% immigrants, so we're not going to have our immigrant communities silenced.
All right, two things. Imputation obviously is guesswork and much harder to guess in things where people are doubled or tripled up in apartments, and therefore you leave a lot of people out. On the citizenship question, is there any sense as to how many people, what percentage of people that might scare away? Last week we had a story from Montana where two women are on a supermarket line speaking Spanish, and they get detained by a border protection agent. So when things like that are in the air, how much scarier is a citizenship question? Aren't people just frightened to begin with?
Well, this is the problem. The fact that the Trump administration put the citizenship question on, there's no valid reason to put it on. And again, it's an attempt to try to silence immigrant communities, not only, frankly, in New York City, but across the country. It's an attempt to defund blue progressive cities and move that funding to red states. And it's also an attempt to disenfranchise people, because we stand to lose up to 2 seats statewide, congressional seats, in terms of redistricting. And that really ultimately, as that plays out across the country, will change the balance of the Electoral College. So this is insidious, and this is why, for the first time, the city is doing this incredibly large outreach effort around the census to make sure that people understand what's at stake and to make sure that every single New Yorker is counted.
What is the status of the lawsuit? Obviously, there's a deadline because they've got to print forms, they've got to do all sorts of things before April 1st, 2020.
Yes, so the second job the mayor appointed me to, in addition to census director, is executive assistant corporation counsel for strategic advocacy in the city's law department. The city, we are one of the plaintiffs on the lawsuit suing the Trump administration for the unlawfulness of this question. We're working closely with the state AG's office and others, and we had a very favorable district court ruling a couple weeks ago by Judge Furman, who struck it down as violating the Administrative Procedures Act. This is a great ruling, but the fight is not over. Right now, the Department of Justice has appealed it not to the appellate court, but direct to the Supreme Court, and we're waiting to hear if the Supreme Court is going to take the case.
What are we going to do differently to attract people, to get people to fill out those census forms that we didn't do 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
So I'll tell you, as someone who chaired Community Board 1 for 7 years and was on the Community Board for a long time, no one ever came to our Community Board and talked about the messaging that if you don't take the 10 minutes to fill out this form, you're likely to lose funding for these vitally important, critical social services. So that's the micro-targeted messaging we're going to do. We're going to explain to every single community across the city what is at stake in terms of a loss of federal funds. This matters to every community, no matter what issue resonates with you and is important to you. It's really linked to a proper count on the census. And perhaps example, as a mother, that I like to bring in most of all, is the New York City Health Department relies on census data in an emergency. So for example, a couple years ago, there was a measles outbreak in Long Island City. They had to quickly determine how many vaccines to order. They look at the census data. So if that information is wrong, it has really critical consequences. So we have to get this right. And for the first time ever, you can fill out the census online and by phone. So we're going to be setting up pop-up centers housed in community organizations all across the city where people can go in, listen to trusted community voices, fill out the census online or by phone.
And now that we have the annual American Community Survey, the sample, we no longer have those long census forms. So as you say, it's probably 5 minutes at the most.
Right.
How much are we going to budget to have you be able to promote the census and reach out to communities?
Sure. So already $4.5 million was allocated, but we need obviously a much larger allocation. The mayor is deeply committed to a much larger allocation. So we're in the process right now of finalizing the budget and getting that allocation later this year as the budget process moves forward. But the mayor has very clearly stated he's willing to put in whatever funding we need to get the message out. And so what we're going to have to do is TV ads, radio ads, print ads in community and ethnic newspapers, and really organizing. It's on the ground, door knocking and community organizing, and also disseminating grants to vitally trusted community partners that are already doing such great work in the city.
Quick last question. Have you found any resistance from any of these groups so far, any immigrant groups or any others?
So I will say, as a daughter of an immigrant, and my mom came here as a Holocaust survivor, it is so important that we get the messaging and the outreach in immigrant communities across the city. Title 13 of the U.S. Code protects the confidentiality of the census, so a federal census worker cannot share that data, or it subjects them to up to 5 years imprisonment and up to $250,000 fine, and that's a ban for life, even if they leave the government. So we need to make sure that people understand the confidentiality of the census. But look, we're fighting the citizenship lawsuit. We did have a great ruling a couple weeks ago, and ultimately the case may wind up at the Supreme Court.
Okay, Julie Menin, thanks for joining us. And coming up next, the Times investigation into the death of a volunteer medic in Gaza. Recently, a team of New York Times reporters investigated the death of a volunteer medic in Gaza in June of last year. The resulting investigation included 60 interviews along with video and photo evidence to attempt to tell the true story of what happened. Here is one of the producers, Malachy Browne, who was over there, worked on that story with David Halfinger, our Jerusalem bureau chief, who I met with in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago. Malachy, this must have been a fascinating project. It involved the death of a 20-year-old Palestinian medic in Gaza, Israelis shooting at protesters who were throwing rocks, who were trying to tear down the fence, a violent confrontation. You tried to reconstruct this using 1,300, you said, videos and photographs. This was like the Zapruder film almost in the Kennedy assassination. Do you think you got an accurate picture, piecing all of that together, of what actually happened?
Yes, I think we did. Our goal was to find out, to freeze that moment in time, and to find out why that shot was taken.
Why the gunshot?
The gunshot was taken, and what were the circumstances around that, and was it justified? And we found that, dozens of people, protesters, bystanders, journalists who were there, and even medics, were filming what was happening that day. And over the course of a week or so, we were able to collect quite a number of videos, and over the course of several months, as you said, 1,300 of them. But not only that, we got the original videos, which meant that we had the timestamp for every one, and we could put them in order and get a deeper understanding of how that day unfolded, escalated, what were the inflection points that forced the Israeli soldiers to start firing live rounds. And as I say, freeze that moment in time. We also, in order to do that, we droned the whole area. We used drone cameras, and we created a 3D model of the space. And it was so high definition that we were able to identify tufts of grass and the pattern of tufts of grass that you see in the videos, to retrace the cameras as they moved around to that fatal moment. And 6 cameras captured the gunshot that killed Razan al-Najjar. And so we were able to position the soldiers at the fence, the medics where they were, and the protesters where they were, and retrace the path of the bullet.
And without necessarily assigning blame, what did the video evidence show?
The video evidence showed that at a point where protesters were drawing nearer to the fence, probably around 40 yards to the fence, and throwing stones over the fence at Israeli soldiers, snipers were deployed, and they fired 4 shots at 4 targets that day. We also interviewed the IDF, and they gave us the precise time codes, which
the Israeli Armed Forces.
The Israeli Armed Forces, which matched our TikTok of our reconstruction of the events. And in that moment, they said that they were firing at a protester wearing a yellow shirt who was acting violently. We were able to identify...
From 120 yards away. Yes. That's an incredible distance.
It was quite a distance. I mean, throughout the day, there were protesters approaching the fence, throwing stones, being repelled by tear gas. And it was this sort of weird, almost, dance between the soldiers and the protesters. Nobody actually touched the fence or got to the fence proper. And at that point, a lot of people had been repelled. They identified a target who they say was acting violently in that moment. We couldn't see in the minutes leading up to that from our video footage active violence. Certainly there was lots of violence there on the protest field that day. And a shot was taken, and it appears to have missed that target and then skidded off the dirt and hit Razan al-Najjar and killed her.
When you showed that, I assume you did, to the Israeli Defense Forces, what was their reaction? Did they say, oops, this is, a horrible tragedy of war, or what?
They mounted an investigation after the outrage that her death caused, and they had very few answers. In fact, most of what they found out about what had happened that day, they found out from us and from David Halpfinger, our Jerusalem bureau chief, who interviewed the commander who was overseeing the investigation. When we showed them the footage, they said it was, they didn't really know what had happened, and that it appeared as if, that a terrible mistake had been made and that she was inadvertently killed. So it was actually towards the end of that interview that they took responsibility, more or less.
When you look at a situation like that, and obviously we are not military strategists, is there any other way to repel that kind of violence? Obviously the violence, as David Halpfinger said, is a public relations stunt for Hamas to create, attention to their cause.
On that day, the tear gas was working. Protesters were being repelled throughout the day. And, at that time, as you said, they were 120 yards away from the fence, the nearest protester along that line of fire. And so, we also calculated the distance of the other protesters who were hit. One of them was about 150 yards away from the fence. And so what this demonstrated to us is that on this day, the Israeli soldiers were breaking even their own rules of engagement. Throughout the campaign and the protests and the policing of the fence, they said that they use live fire only as a last resort. To protect Israeli lives at the other side of the fence. And I think from the Israeli perspective, a large crowd of milling protesters is quite a threat if that fence were to be broken. But essentially what you're seeing here is, picking off instigators in the crowd at some distance when there isn't necessarily an imminent threat.
Pretty amazing. You started off as an engineer and became a journalist. This shows enormous potential for forensic video as a tool in journalism.
Correct. I mean, it's a combination of sort of science and engineering and 3D reconstructions and use of data and that sort of thing. So, it's becoming ever more multidisciplinary, I suppose.
Fascinating to read and to see. Malachy Browne of the New York Times. If you haven't seen it, go back and look at nytimes.com, and I'll have some thoughts on CODA next. If any New York City mayor needed reminding that all politics is local, he should look back to where John Lindsay was 50 years ago this month. He was stuck in Queens in 15 inches of snow that his sanitation department had neglected to clear for days. TV appearances with Johnny Carson would transform Lindsay into a national celebrity, but celebrity failed to translate into popularity. In 1972, when Lindsay ran for president, he didn't win a single delegate. The same was true after 9/11 for Rudy Giuliani, when he ran for president in 2008. When Bill de Blasio traipses through wintry New Hampshire, as he was scheduled to do this weekend, he might be wise to remember the lessons that the historic snows of yesteryear hold for mayors in America. No mayor of a major city has ever been elected president, unless you count Calvin Coolidge of Northampton, Massachusetts, and Grover Cleveland of Buffalo. No mayor of New York has won federal elective office since Fernando Wood was elected to Congress in 1862. In the 19th century, John T. Hoffman was elected governor. In the 20th century, former Mayor John F. Hyland was named to the Children's Court by his successor as mayor, James J. Walker. Walker couldn't help but interjecting that, quote, "The appointment of Judge Hyland means that the children can now be tried by their peer." It's true that with Washington punting on urban issues, what goes on in local government has become more vital, and that Mike Bloomberg may well defy the odds, as he did in 2001, and break the curse that City Hall is a political dead end. But de Blasio is not a celebrity. He is not particularly popular. And locally, in a recent Quinnipiac poll, only 5% of New York State residents said of the potential New Yorkers in the race, de Blasio would make the best president. Decades ago, in their seminal book, Governing New York City, Wallace Sayre and Herbert Kaufman presciently observed what kept our mayors from the White House. While the presidency can elevate even average people, they wrote, the mayoralty is the highly vulnerable symbol of all defects in the city and its government. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.